Welcome. Happy Monday, everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some new ones. By way of introduction, my name is Radha Ruparel. I will be hosting our conversation today. For anyone who's new to this space, just to remind us, this People First community is a coalition of actors. We've now got 500 individuals and organizations and growing. And we've come together with this idea that if we want to achieve sustainable development, that's not going to happen through technical interventions alone. We have to invest in people, and we have to in particular invest in local leadership, those who are most proximate to the challenges we're working to address, those who experienced injustices. And because of that, I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for the conversation today, which is Cheryl Dorsey. Cheryl is the president of Echoing Green. That's an organization that's been working for the last few decades to find emerging social entrepreneurs and then really invest in their ideas and their leadership development. And they've worked with social entrepreneurs all around the world who are working on some of the world's biggest challenges. And one of the reasons I'm really excited to have Cheryl in conversation with us today is, as you know, in these People First talks, what we've been trying to do is learn from different members of our community things about what's the kind of leadership we need and how to develop it and how different organizations are developing it. But another conversation we've been having is who should lead? And I know Cheryl and Echo and Green have done tremendous work to think about that question and also to think about some of the power structures that get in the way from those who oftentimes are most proximate to the work from being able to exercise their leadership. So we'll talk a lot about justice and power today and how that connects to this conversation around leadership. All right, so with that, I want to get us right into it because it's going to be a good conversation. Again, for anyone who hasn't joined before, I'll be in conversation with Cheryl, but what we like to do is make this really interactive. So as I'm going along, please put your questions in the chat. I'll bring you off mute and we'll make this really, really interactive. All right, with that, Cheryl, I'm going to start off with the basic question to get us going. Just tell us a little bit about what Echoing Green does and what got you into this work.
Sure. Good morning, good evening. I got to start with a lot of thanks and gratitude. Want to really thank you, Wendy, for your longtime friendship and leadership, inviting me to do this. This really means a lot. And it's been wonderful to work with Radha to prepare for this talk. And Matt, thanks for getting sort of the technical platform ready to have this interesting conversation. Appreciate all of you who have joined to engage in this conversation, including my colleague, Dr. Kimberly Osagie, Vice President of Programs from Echoing Green. So I'm very excited about all of us being together today, this evening, wherever you find yourselves in the world. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So very quickly, if you have not heard of Echoing Green, our job in the world is to find emerging leaders with some of the best ideas for social innovation as early as possible in that entrepreneur's journey and help to set them on the path to a lifetime of impact and change. Let me just quickly share Echoing Green's definition of social innovation. It's simply the process of developing and deploying effective solutions to challenging and often systemic social and environmental issues, all done in support of social progress. And we really go about the work of identifying these emerging social impact leaders and supporting them in three ways. We identify and select a diverse group of them at a very early stage, and we do that through an annual global search process. We then invest deeply in them as leaders, focusing on their ideas much more than sort of the organizations. Through our fellowship program, really provides mentoring, support, focusing on elevating the needs of these leaders at these early stages and helping them to make the kinds of connections that are really important as they try to access new resources to further their work. And then last but not least, we are very intentional about engaging and educating a very broad ecosystem of other networks that we believe will help to maximize these leaders' impact and support them long into the future. We identify thousands of these potential social innovators a year. We only select a few to invest in annually. And now over the past 35 years, there have been about 900 of us or so, including Wendy and I, who have been part of the Echoing Green community. And we now have a footprint in about 90 countries around the world, as well as in recent years, a deep focus on work here in the United States, where I'm dialing in from. So I got into this work a really long time ago. I have been studying structural inequities. I don't know if we called it that back in the day, almost 40 years ago. But I spent a lot of time as a young person thinking about public health systems in the United States in particular, and especially in pre-Civil War America. I was very interested in how public health systems were built, not to support the sizable free Black population that existed in my hometown, Baltimore, Maryland, but rather how those systems were built to protect the white population from the Black population. And in many ways, that helped me really formulate my thinking on structural inequities. How are they built? How are they maintained? I then broadened my studies to think about how these structural inequities continue to play out in 20th century America. And some of those dialing in from across the world may not be familiar with one of the most shameful incidents in the history of the United States. It's something called the Tuskegee syphilis study that was carried out by the U.S. government that had its roots in U.S. public health. From 1932 to 1974, the U.S. government intentionally tracked about 100 African American men who had syphilis and left them untreated to see what the long-term impacts would be, even though there was an easy, cheap treatment for syphilis, i.e. penicillin, but watch them slowly and painfully die over the course of these 40 years. It was just a horrific story of structural inequity at the intersection of race, medical ethics, and medical practice. So again, I think I've long been interested in those intersections, and it led me to the work I do now, because when I was in medical school many, many moons ago, I co-founded, with the help of Echoing Green, a mobile health unit that worked in inner city Boston that focused on racial health disparities in infant mortality rates in the city of Boston. Echoing Green invested in me, believed in me those 30 plus years ago, and set me on this path to thinking about the role of social change in disrupting structural inequities. So I said a lot, Radha. I'll stop here. And if you need me to dig in on anything further, please let me know, or we can just sort of continue to march on to get to our conversation with the group.
No, this is the exact type of conversation we want to have. So thanks, Cheryl. And it's just so helpful to understand where you came from and what inspired you to get into this work, and that you are also supported now by the organization you're leading. So I really want to get into those conversations around structural inequity, because it's so at the heart of the work we do. So we're going to get there in just a moment. But before we do that, just a couple of the basic questions. So you've just starting with that first premise. You said our first step is to identify social entrepreneurs. And you have a lot of people who are coming to you. What are some of the leadership traits you look for, and how do you select for those? Can you just tell us a little bit about that, and then we're going to get to some of these deeper questions in just a moment.
Sure, and I'll. I think one of the reasons you, Wendy, and you, Radha, and the team asked me to come and speak is that we are unapologetically a leader-first organization, because we fundamentally believe that leaders are central to any understanding of how change happens, large-scale change happens. And it's sort of like an equation. When you look at a leader, they turn a vision and a mobilized following into a transformational force for good. And Echoing Green is predicated on that belief. So, when we're receiving, thousands of social business plans each year, we are heavily weighting leadership characteristics and really, quite honestly, diminishing sort of the social business plan. Number one, because we don't think it's so important, because number two, these leaders come to us at such an early stage that the business plan is really only worth the paper or the electronic medium on which it's sent to us. And we know how entrepreneurs will pivot and iterate and change based on incoming real-time feedback. So we really focus on those leadership characteristics. So what are we looking for? We think Passion is critical. So it's sort of the catalytic fuel that keeps you going in the long, hard slog of doing this work. This work is very, very difficult. In many ways, passion is that protective coating that allows you to continue on when you lack belief from others, resources from others, traction. So it's absolutely critical. Purpose is the North Star that allows you to remember why you do the work and to sort of stiffen your spine as you're trying to set out an aspirational goal for others with whom you to work to rally around. And, you know, both passion and purpose lead us to the next trait that is very important to the work we do looking for entrepreneurs, the trait of resilience. And that is tightly aligned to the belief and the knowledge that failure is absolutely endemic to this work. You're going to fail. We don't care if you fail. It's simply how you respond to that failure. And having, you know, as Angela Duckworth talked about, that grit, that determination, that resilience to continue on is critical to doing this work. And then we are looking for sort of what we call identity alignment, sort of looking at leaders who embrace causes that are inextricably linked to their personal experiences and their core values. And it sort of places you contextually in the world and allows you to understand yourself in the world. And we think this is really important because individually leaders are important, but they've got to be part of and absorbed into larger movements. So understanding very clearly where you fit in larger movements is critical. Did I hear you say something, Radha, before I move on?
No, but can I ask a follow-up question about what you
Please.
shared? Yeah, no, this is really fascinating, especially that last piece around just understanding where you fit into a larger movement. I think we've been talking a lot in this series around collective leadership. Everyone has a different role to play, but understanding that role that you have uniquely to play matters. I mean, you're selecting these social entrepreneurs when they're at the beginning of their journey. So I'm just curious, as you're looking for some of these leadership traits, what's the specific process of even looking for that? Is that asking them questions? Is that deeply interviewing? Is it looking at some of their early track record, their past experience? Like, how do you assess for some of this stuff just so early on?
Absolutely. So part of it is we deeply believe that our selection process is a relational process. It is highly relational. It plays out over the course of 4 to 6 months. You've got to sort of not only get to know people, you've got to deeply see them. And you see them through a variety of different vantage points. Some of it comes through of what's the path they've taken, what activities were they drawn to, or did they create, what opportunities did they create, how do others see them in the world, letters of recommendation, testimonials from others, how do people talk about their work and how do they show up in the work. It's always, and I think we all know this working with leaders, we talk about an important quality, sort of a humanistic approach. If someone says us versus we, my radar goes up, right? So again, where are you in relation to the folks with whom you work? And it is about we, it's not about us versus them. Sort of that noblesse oblige that is detrimental and hierarchical and hegemonic, we're having none of it, right? So all those big clues and little clues, when you add them up together, it really matters. And I will say, you know, we've been doing this for almost, 40 years now. And there's something really powerful, and I know you all know this as well at TFA, around pattern recognition. That's why our fellows, our alums lead our process, because you know it when you see it. I'm a big believer in gut and intuition. I think it is a powerful form of data that is diminished and marginalized in a lot of harmful ways. You know it. And so celebrating that and leveraging that as a key data point to help you get to the right answer is helpful. And it was interesting, years ago, we did sort of a back of the envelope calculation and said, okay, how likely is an applicant to become a fellow if another Echoing Green fellow or alum recommends her? And it literally is like 9-1, right? Like they're such sticky leaders. And I consider Wendy, and Wendy has been great about sending TFA core members into our fold. We've got many incredible TFA core members who are part of our family, where you know it when you see it, and you understand the value set, the skill set, the gifts that these folks have that make them a fit for a social innovation leadership fellowship.
Yeah, I love that. It gets to the power of the network. And I also really like the what you said about the small things matter. And sometimes it's looking at multiple sources of wisdom, not just the ones that are easy to measure, but sometimes the ones that have been discounted again in some of our models. I love that you named that, Cheryl. Let's now get into some of the heart of what you were sharing in your introduction. So you've got these social entrepreneurs. We now have them selected, but they're going to face many challenges. And one of the challenges I know that you've thought a lot about is power, systemic injustice. So how has that shown up at Echoing Green? And can you share more about what you've thought about that in the context of Echoing Green, and what are some of the things that you've done about that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, I've watched, Wendy and I go way back, and I say I'm an OG for sure. And I've sort of watched the terminology change, the frameworks change. I would say I came into this work as a pretty typical social justice baby. I believe in sort of social justice as a practice around equity, around shared opportunity for all. But recognizing that structures of inequality and oppression and hegemony are at the root of preventing more of us having the ability to thrive. And I think, we talk about justice, innovation, systems change, but until we're explicit about having a trenchant power analysis, we are never, ever going to get to where we need to go. And I think increasingly, as we become a more global, multiracial, multi-ethnic society, I think we've done a good job as social change practitioners of focusing on oppression. And I'll define each, because I do think it's important. So, when you think about definitions, oppression is sort of clear, right? It's sort of the systematic, unjust treatment or subjugation of a particular group, based on whatever characteristic: race, gender, class, sexuality, other religious identity, a variety of identity factors. And it involves sort of the bold use of power to limit their opportunities, to marginalize them. And it's direct, it's coercive, and that is clear. And so a lot of social justice activity has gone into confronting forms of oppression. That's a form of power. But a related concept, but different, is this concept of hegemony, which I'm increasingly obsessed with, which is all about sort of the dominance of a particular group, of one group over another group, whether it be dominance of one state over the other, one class of folks over the other, one race or gender over the other. And it's all about that dominance group ability to set the narrative frame, to influence behavior, to shape norms, to control value sets and institutions. And it's a subtler, more indirect, but more pervasive exercise of power. And I think we are in a moment where hegemonic forces still set the terms of debate, right? Sort of extraction versus regenerative practices, white backlash versus Black power, women being marginalized and subordinated versus equity for all. This is the world in which we live. It's sort of like, I often say, if you're a fish swimming in a pond and you're bumping up against fishing nets or buoys, that's oppression. You can't get past it. It's hitting you. It's direct. But swimming in dirty water, you don't even know you're swimming in it. It is like the oxygen we all breathe, and it is fundamental to begin to dismantle, reimagine, and fundamentally rebuild in new ways these hegemonic forces that prevent all of us from thriving. And in particular, that's why, number one, I got into the work of social innovation, because I believe disruption, the ability to leapfrog, is critical to overcoming and dismantling hegemonic forces. And I also believe that's why I'm so enamored with your people first framework, because I think institutions and organizations are part of hegemonic structures. That's the way hegemonic forces work, mostly through institutions, traditions, of well-resourced institutions, that you need people to disrupt the way those organizations work. So it all has to come together in ways that unlock and unleash new ways, and in many ways, radical and revolutionary thinking.
Yeah, that's so, so helpful. I just love your definitions and this idea of, again, hegemonic forces that make a real difference in the paradigms we're operating in, but we might not even realize that sometimes, depending on where we're sitting. So walk us through then some of the ways that you've been trying to disrupt this. And I know in previous conversations, we've talked about how you've been trying to disrupt Echoing Green as an institution. I know you've talked about collective power and advocacy. I'm also curious if you do any work with the individual social entrepreneurs around them confronting power and biases. So maybe you can give us a couple of examples of, these are big forces. What can we practically start doing to develop the next generation of leaders to really internalize and actually disrupt these forces?
Yeah, it's a really such an important question. And it is, one day at a time, every day. It is a multi-layered, complex set of activities that are required to try to take on these forces. So I would say it starts at home, right? You got to take a long, hard look at yourself, as well as the organization in which you exist and travel. And I would say sort of personally, and I can come back to this later, sort of many of us, and I think this is especially true of marginalized folks, seeing power as sort of dirty or corrupt. Power is a neutral thing, right? It's like, and again, I think human being, it is true, power corrupts, but not always. Power, if deployed appropriately, can be a really useful tool. That's what it is. So I think number one is individuals deeply understanding what power is. And I can come back later to sort of a definition of power that I think is a good one, of how you leverage it. So I think as individuals, and I'll use myself as an example, recognizing that power was not dirty, was not sort of drawing me in and co-opting me to become the man, right? That it was something that I could leverage, a resource I could leverage to help the community, and that we could each, as part of this constellation of Echoing Green, use to support one another. So there's your individual responsibility to leverage your assets and power to support the whole. There's also sort of self-reflective work that organizations need to do to go on their own journey around centering proximity, centering inclusion and belonging, and trying to live up to your ideas and your ideals. For Echoing Green, we often say by, for, and of fellows, and trying to live that every single day. And whether it's like, what would a fellow do? What does a fellow need? What are we doing that is not fully supportive of our community? And being true and steadfast to that belief, really important. And then sort of once you've done that, sort of the personal organizational journey, then turning on the catalytic power of your organization. And I remember, years ago, two Echoing Green alums wrote a wonderful book called Forces for Good, and Wendy and Teach for America are featured in the book, about how do good nonprofits go from good to great, and a really wonderful learning module about what Wendy did was like, direct service is important. Look, has dedicated her life to building this civil rights movements around education reform, getting amazing young folks like you all engaged in the education reform movement now globally. But then once you've got that direct service model, then engaging around advocacy, community building, sort of advocacy work that takes your core competency and expertise and knowledge and exports it to magnify and amplify your power, your authority, your influence. I think TFA is a great example of that. And I think Echoing Green has done that through a lot of the racial equity work we've done over the last couple of years, saying we're best in class at finding amazing leaders all over the world. Why in the world is it that our Black leaders are raising 24% less revenue than our white leaders, 76% less unrestricted net assets? That's lunacy, right? And then taking those numbers, the numbers don't lie, taking that, partnering with friends across the sector from Bridgeband to others to get that message out there as a way to confront philanthropy and say, we've got to change the way we all do business. So in many ways, that was our first real foray into advocacy. And we think it was incredibly powerful and important to create a new conversation in the sector. And then I think last but not least, we've got to fundamentally build brand new systems. I think that's what you guys are doing around sustainable development. I'm always blown away by the stat that I read years ago when an Ethiopian activist was like, look, the fact that most global aid is going through non-proximate organizations and like 3% is going to proximate groups. And, she and others said, we're going to start this campaign, the grand bargain. And in 5 years, we want to make sure 25% of global aid goes to proximate actors. In 5 years, it was less. It went down to 2.5%. It's stunning. So the work that you were doing around People First is another example of advocacy that is critical. And in our much smaller way, Echoing Green is sort of really laser focused on this capital gap for leaders of color, proximate leaders, women, intersectional leaders. And we have shown the philanthropic sector what is wrong with these capital allocations, infrastructure and structures. It's not going to get fixed fast enough. So in fact, we have now launched our own fund, our own sidecar catalytic capital fund that's going to provide the kind of capital and capital stacks that our fellows in Echoing Green have been waiting for 30 years. If we don't build it, no one else will. So I think we're all thinking in that kind of way of how you do this work on many different levels and many different layers.
Yeah, that's just incredible, Cheryl, because I think so much of what we're talking about is, again, the collective work. So what I heard you say is it's not an individual issue, it's a collective issue. We've got to raise voice to it. And is there anything else that you learned from doing this collective advocacy work? Because this is also a big part of this People First community. It sounds like it was gathering players, it was recognizing that no one's doing something, so you played a role. But yet, anything else that you've learned around what this actual collective advocacy work takes, lessons learned from just even your work around changing how capital is allocated?
Yeah, so many lessons learned, but I'm excited to get to our conversation together. I mean, I'll say two things. One is, and you all know this as well as we at Echoing Green know this, that trust is critical to all of this work. If there is no trust, there is it is sort of the relational capital that greases the wheels to get this work done in a relational way. So it sort of centering trust, especially in moments like these where we are in a trust recession, it is absolutely important that part of the work of these collectives is tending to and nurturing forces of trust, which includes transparency, accountability, space for voice. All of that is really critical. And then the last thing I'll say, we're about it's like 21st anniversary of a really powerful book that is sort of front and center on my bookshelves. Professor Robin Kelly wrote in, I think 2001 or 2002, a book called Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination. And it was a really interesting central insight. And he looked at, mostly U.S. social movements. And most of, for those of you who are joining in from around the world, most U.S. social movements have been funded by individuals, but big chunks of money over the course of time have come from institutional funders, from foundations. But the way that funders think about the work is that they're trying to win. They put money behind winnable campaigns, but that undercuts the really difficult and patient work of collective thinking, of base building, of cultivating the vision of the world that we're all fighting so hard to build. And I think, that's probably a long, way of just saying, like, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And we're the marathoners, and we're taking the 20, 30, 40 year view and getting our sector to say that this is the long play. And if you stop thinking so much about the short-term winnable campaigns, wow, the success that we're going to have. So I think those are maybe two insights I've had.
That's so helpful, Cheryl. And it connects the themes we've been talking about, right? Collective leadership requires collectively creating visions. It requires keeping attention on the long game. And yeah, it requires courageous work, which I hear you doing as well. So thank you for that. Let me switch back gears to a question that's in the chat from Wendy that gets actually to the core of what a lot of these conversations are around about the leadership we need. So Wendy, do you mind just coming off mute and sharing your question?
Hi. Thank you for all this, Cheryl, which is also good to reflect on. I was just curious about, I've seen so many of your newer generation fellows and have heard them just rave about the kind of support and professional development that they get through the kind of Echoing Green programming. And I'm just curious what you feel like you've learned over time about the kind of supports and kind of professional development, leadership development that's most impactful for them.
Oh, thanks, Wendy. And again, right, it is a work in progress. And part of it is, you make the road by walking, and each generation of us at Echoing Green tweaks, iterates, pokes and prods, and we continue to think about it. Are my colleagues, I've got a number of my colleagues on the call. Yay. Thank you, Kimberly and Liza and Swan, for joining. Kimberly, Liza, Swan, will you all kill me if I put you on the spot? Because you all have been much closer to the programming work over the past couple of years. Can some of you chime in? I'd love to get your take on some of this stuff.
We won't kill you. We'll happily, we will happily talk about the work of our program. Hi, all. Pleasure to be here and listen to Cheryl's great wisdom from a long time in this game. And I get the great pleasure of working with our fellows pretty closely running our program. And I think to Cheryl's point about and to Wendy, what you're hearing about folks being thrilled about the connection to the Echoing Green community, one of the key pieces that is really strong is our fellow-to-fellow mentorship work, which is really when we pair some of our newer fellows with our alumni. And we try to pair them intentionally around a number of demographics around folks' personal identity, around the issue area they're working on, given that we've got folks working on all sorts of issues across the world, and we're issue area agnostic in our support, as well as geography. It's helpful to have someone in your same time zone who is also weathering the similar challenges to you. And so a number of our fellows speak really highly of that one-to-one fellow mentorship or matching, and how they really are able to find someone in this big community of 1,000 folks across so many countries who has a sense of both the personal impact of leading towards change in intractable systems and the technical auspices of building an organization that's going to be durable enough to disrupt systems around the world. So that's one piece that our fellows really speak highly about. And I think there's this other piece that's less technical and that's more affective that I think our fellows rave about, which is that in the spirit of being leader forward, there are so many spaces where our fellows, our innovators show up and are asked to produce and are asked to be intellectual as opposed to human, and all of the holisticness that is humanity. And so I think another piece that our fellows speak highly about is that we try to build and create spaces, even in technical assistance provision, that allow our fellows to show up vulnerably as their whole selves. So when we bring fellows together virtually and in person, we ask folks to kind of drop the pitch deck and just speak with candor about what they're experiencing as humans and as leaders. And we find that that actually accelerates folks' access to technical assistance provision, because that honesty actually opens doors to much more intentional and thoughtful partnering. And last but not least, I'll say we really try to curate partnerships with external providers who have deep expertise in particular areas. And so our most often requested thought partnership is around fundraising. And so we try to find the best of the best folks who think really intentionally about their fundraising within our fellow community and beyond to come and shower folks with perspective there. Finance is a second one that we are often looking for great partners around and supporting our fellows around. And then there's a whole gamut of other topics that our fellows are seeking, ranging from HR, making your first or second or third hire with great intention, to marketing and moving from being one person with a pitch deck to really thinking about building a brand such that you can turnkey that into sustainable and tenable fundraising. Those are my off tops, but any of my other colleagues, if you have anything to add.
I can chime in very quickly. Hi, everybody. Pleasure to be here. Whoops. I'm spotlit. Hey, everybody. Wonderful to be in this space with you all. Wonderful to hear comments that Cheryl and Kimberly are sharing. I'm Ricardo Jara. I'm the Senior Director of Community at Echo and Green, and I have the privilege, like really extreme privilege, of working very closely with our newest fellows and the programming that they experience when they become fellows. And plus one to everything that Kimberly has shared. I'll add that when we think about content delivery, we're very intentional about the what and the how, right? So to Kimberly's point about the what, we really strive to be responsive to the needs that our fellows are naming in the challenges of starting an organization, right? So I'm thinking about the curriculum that we have this year. We made some shifts this year based on what we heard from our fellows this past summer about, hey, we wish we had more opportunities to discuss basic financial fundamentals. I keep bringing that up because that was it was echoed consistently from fellows, like, hey, how do I manage my budget, right? But it's also in the how. So again, to Kimberly's point, we really strive to ensure that the facilitators, the experts that we bring in, many of whom are our own fellows, they're alumni who come back to share their expertise and what they have learned, that they engage in a very authentic, real talk kind of way, right? Like, here's the expertise, the wisdom, the gems that we're dropping. And also, like, here's the real talk, right? We're not going to try to drop all this jargon and try to think that we are in some way better than you and where you're at. Wherever you are, we are connecting with you and we are giving you the real life experience that you need to navigate your journey in the best way possible. So that's something that I also just wanted to lift up as something that is, very special with our programming with our new fellows. So, pleasure to be here.
So helpful. Love hearing these other voices and just the specificity of some of the things that you're working on. And it sparked something for me, Cheryl, when we were speaking before. You mentioned on this that reflective practice that you have a secular chaplaincy program. Can you share more about that, or either you or Kimberly or Ricardo, that connects the inner to the outer work? I'd be curious to just hear more about that.
Sure. Yeah, timely. Wendy, I don't know if you're going to the 25th anniversary celebration of a new profit started by an incredible social entrepreneur, Vanessa Kirsch, an Echo and Green alum, on Wednesday. But I'm driving up to Boston tomorrow to have dinner with an Echo and Green alum who about 12 or 13 years ago started Echo and Green's secular chaplaincy program. And an incredible young man, Eric Dawson, who started a social enterprise called Peace First, was called Peace Games many years ago. But years ago, Eric, who was a teacher, educator, went back to divinity school, and he came to Echo and Green and said, hey, turns out that there are lots of institutions that have chaplains. Congress, U.S. Congress has a chaplain, hospitals have chaplains, the National Football League has chaplains, hospitals all over the world have chaplains. Why don't social change leaders, social justice practitioners have chaplains? I thought that was not just an amazing rhetorical question. I'm like, what a good question. I don't know the answer to that. How are we neglecting the soul work when, people are putting their lives, their hearts, their souls on the line every single day. So with that query, Eric, along with two of his fellow graduate students, Jasmine and Chandra, they started Echoing Green Secular Chaplaincy Program, which was to put sort of the spiritual, deeply personal aspects of the work first, right? It's sort of the notion like when you're on the plane, put your own oxygen mask on first so you can tend to others. Because what we found is you don't get into this work through an intellectual lens. You get into this work because you are deeply committed to the problem and deeply committed to those who are navigating the consequences of that problem every single day. And it can destroy you. It can burn you out. And we have the science and the physiology that talks about the neuroendocrine approach of trauma, how it weathers our cells. So Echoing Green felt we were not providing holistic support without providing the secular chaplaincy support 24/7, confidential, available to any fellow anytime when you need it, but increasingly recognizing that it was also about not just the one-to-one work, but how do you hold space for this broader community? So our chaplains think about the flow of our gatherings. They start and end our days. Ricardo did a beautiful job when we went to Minneapolis in June, convening many of our fellows, trying to honor Minneapolis as a sacred space for the work of racial justice in this country after the murder of Mr. Floyd in 2020. So the chaplains were there to create and hold that space for all of us, but also then sharing their tools, their wisdoms. So when fellows go back to their organizations, how they incorporate those same well-being maintenance practices into their organizations. I'm really proud of that work. Ricardo, I don't know if you want to say anything else about Eric and the chaplain's work.
Yeah, they make you cry in all the good ways. It's really, the therapeutic encounters is what they are, experiences with our chaplaincy. And I think you summarized it very beautifully, Cheryl. I'll add that our chaplains are accessible to not only all of our fellows. So when you complete the program, our alumni, we've had alumni from 10, 15 years ago reach out to our chaplains and connect with them and use that resource along with all of our other resources that we have available. So yeah, it's a very unique, special support that we offer to our fellows that many take advantage of. So yeah.
Thank you, Ricardo and Cheryl. We talk so much about, I think there's a growing conversation around well-being, around addressing trauma, but it's really helpful to hear how you're practically thinking about this. And this idea that it's not just about individual healing, but about how do we do some of that collective work around healing. So really appreciated hearing how you're thinking about this support. I think others might reach out to you for specific questions as maybe others want to think about this in their programs. I'm going to ask one or two final questions, but for anyone who's here listening, this is your chance to ask Cheryl and her team any other questions you have burning in your mind. So please put them in the chat. But while I'm waiting for those, one or two more questions for you. Cheryl, or to anyone in your team, we've talked a lot about the leadership development support you provide to these fellows in their early years. But there's also this community and network that includes alumni. Is there anything that you do to support leaders who are further along in their journey? Or how do you think about this community and network and how that enables leadership over kind of somebody's lifetime?
Yeah, and I'm going to ask my colleagues to jump in and refine and build on what I share. I mean, we've got a couple of catchphrases, by, for, of fellows, we're ride or die for our fellows, but also once a fellow, always a fellow. There are fellows who work for Echoing Green, the Echoing Green alum who has started our Catalytic Capital Fund, sort of providing new forms of capital to our fellows, is an Echoing Green alum from 1998 who came back home to give back to the community. Our fellows are our bosses. They're on our board. We and Kimberly can talk more about this. We have done a lot of programming over the past couple of years on HBCU campuses for our global friends, that's historically Black colleges and universities in the United States that predominantly serve African-American young folks. A lot of that programming is delivered by our alumni. And, for many years there, I think the dynamic, and a lot of it was my fault of saying, oh, what can we do for our alums? Because we're so focused on, we've got to help them, recognizing that our alums they're global leaders. Wendy and so many others I could name who say, no, I want to give back to Echoing Green. So being intentional about creating those pathways to provide that reciprocal support has been incredible. They read applications, they judge for us. It is a joint effort by the collective, and I sort of say the wisdom of the crowds for sure. But I do think there is a lot about collective hand holding, and they can't discount, and Kimberly mentioned this, the power of affinity groups. I mean, I'm still a member of our Black Women Leaders Affinity Group. I'm thirsty for those quarterly calls to check in with folks, other Black women working around the world, sort of sharing personal and professional struggles and getting advice and counsel. That has been really incredibly important. And just being good stewards of the organization and our values. But would love anybody else, Ricardo, Kimberly, Liza, anybody, jump on in.
Yeah, I think you've already said so many juicy things, Cheryl. And I think I would punctuate. I think we try to continue supporting our alum with capital, with their emerging capacity needs, and with the Echoing Green community. And so if I use those 3 C's, capital-wise, Cheryl has mentioned our catalytic capital fund that we are launching, and it's really focused on post early seed capital, post mid-stage development, when you're really trying to say to the world and announce to the world that you really are a thought leader in your space. What does that capital shift look like? And so we're supporting our alum with capital post the initial fellowship. We're also supporting our alum to continue building and deepening their capacity. And I think oftentimes a lot of our work is about advocacy for the great work that our alum are doing on the ground. And so we are singing the praises of our fellows as they are farther along down the line. And we're nominating them and recommending them for other accolades that are going to help them to continue doing their work across the country in a deeper and more impactful way. And so that's a piece of that work too. And I think in the community vein, to Cheryl's note about affinity spaces, I mean, our fellows, I think because we are leader forward and because the work is passion forward and purpose forward, that means our fellows feel like they have found people who are there, as close to family as one could be without a blood relation. And so they are hungry to continue spending time with, learning from, and nurturing those relationships. And so we try to get out of the way and just let that happen. Hence these affinity spaces. There's a DC gathering that's happening in a couple of weeks from now. That's just fellows said, "Gosh, we've got to get together." And we're like, "Okay." And I think it's in someone's backyard. Just like we just need to be in fellowship and in companionship with folks. And so we're like, we don't need to be hands-on here. You all do the thing, and we're happy to show up if we're invited. And so I think that's a piece of the fellow community too, is that we've found and selected the right people with the right spirits, brains, and hearts. And so some of it propels beyond us as staff of this organization. And to this last point that Cheryl mentioned around our HBCU work, I think that's another testament of we have fellows that represent a number of communities around the world. And so they are then going back into those communities and saying, here's this real viable option around social innovation as a way to change the world. And so I just want to proselytize about it. I want to preach about it. I want to talk about it. And so we have a lot of our alumni helping us to identify new communities that we should be talking to and engaging with to enlist other loving warriors in the path toward equity around the world.
So much great stuff in there, Kimberly. And I think what I'm sensing is just the power of people, the power of the network, the relationships, and creating spaces where people can really come together and being intentional about that, but letting some of these organically emerge. I want to bring in a couple more questions from the chat because Cheryl, you spoke about trust. And I see a question here in the chat from Lily. How do you think about growing trust at scale? So how have you been thinking about this deeper work that sometimes individual takes time, trust, as you're building a scaling organization? Have you wrestled with any challenges there, biggest learnings there? And I'll throw in one more question right after that.
Sure. And, Kimberly and I have had this conversation, and Kimberly, jump in as well. Kimberly and I have had this conversation over time about, weak ties, deep ties, and how they're essential to building networks and the network effect. And you need both. They're not one better than the other. They're just different, but they're both required to build a very sticky network. And I do think we've gotten to the point where we have enough brand equity, and there's just something sort of magical and important about Echoing Green identifying these leaders at a very important and vulnerable inflection point in their lives and their careers, that it ties them to this organization in a way, in such a sticky way that I've found with few other networks. So the deeper ties are easier to maintain. Sort of the weaker ties requires walking the walk around a fellow first approach. They've got to see it, they've got to believe it, and you've got to be prepared when you mess up, which you invariably will, that you will take the criticism and then hear it, absorb it, and then ask the community's help in fixing it. And there's both a level of, you got to have some tough skin, because when you work with a lot of activists, they're really good at shining a spotlight of where you effed up, and they're going to tell you. But the beauty is they're not going to abandon you. They're going to help you fix it. And sort of you demonstrating trust in the broader community that I know you love me despite my failings and failures, but we will figure this out together, I think is so very important. And just trying to be communicative, which we're not always being, we're not trying to do it on purpose. You're just busy. You're trying to keep your, communicating often across various modalities. So you meet people where they are. All of that is required. And it's a trust. I mean, it's a practice, not not a performance. You got to do it all the time. You got to practice. And I think we all get busy and forget to do it in the way that we need to. But if you incorporate it and think about it front and center, it serves you well. Kimberly, what did I forget?
You didn't forget anything at all. I'd say to codify this deep versus weak ties piece. We think about, it's why we think really intentionally about enlisting small cohorts into the fellowship. And so as opposed to, saying, all right, the next 100 people, there are 100 folks with great ideas, let's have them all. We think really intentionally about these small 20 to 40 person cohorts so that folks can establish those deep connections within those cohorts, hyper vulnerability about not only personal challenges, but leadership challenges. And that space becomes a really safe learning ground that then helps to translate to how folks engage in the broader Echoing Green Fellow community of 1,000 across 90 countries. Essentially, the foundation that folks get in that depth of relationship in their cohort then translates to, oh, I think all Echoing Green people function in this particular way, which is leader forward, vulnerability forward. And so knowing that, I feel safe to ask that next question, to get that next connection or relationship from this broader Echoing Green family, which then broadens each fellow's family exponentially because each of those fellows has the next connection to folks around the social innovation sector around the world. So I think we start with this depth of relationship in the cohort that then translates to the broader community, which then translates to the sector. And that's a piece of how we think about trust. It starts in miniature, small, and then expands.
That is really, really helpful. like usual, whenever we have a good conversation, we're running out of time and we're not going to get to everybody's questions, but I might share some of these that we didn't get to with you all afterwards, if you don't mind sharing your thoughts. But maybe let me close off with one question. And Cheryl, I'm going to give you two choices. Either there's something that you didn't get to that you really want to say, or the second option is, we've talked a lot about developing leadership out there, but it starts with developing leadership in here. So I'm curious, like, what have you learned about your own leadership along the way, or what practices or have you put in place around your own leadership? So either something you wanted to say you didn't get to, or just a reflection on how has your own leadership evolved through this journey.
Oh boy. Well, you know what? I'll quickly I think I addressed sort of the personal journey. And maybe being intersectional as a person of color, a woman coming from a lovely middle class family, sort of my relationship to power and getting comfortable with that. I think we all need to think about that. And I think that I have evolved and learned and grown. But I sort of think in this moment, sort of a call to action. We are in a really difficult time for a whole bunch of reasons. And I think part of it is that the old hegemonic structures are crumbling before our eyes, right? And these are sort of the death rattles, the death knells of these, and the fallout is terrible. And so I think a people first, a leader first approach is really critical in this moment if we're going to build the kind of global, multiracial, multicultural, more just and equitable society that we are all desperate to see. And I think why leaders are going to matter is important for not only sort of democratic practice, but more broadly for sort of maintaining people and planet for a couple of reasons. One is a lot of the work that needs to be done is being able to forge alliances across difference in sector. People do that, right? Sort of relational work. I think we're well suited to take that on. Also, the notion that as these hegemonic forces are crumbling, but holding on for dear life in kind of scary ways, the notion that change often happens through persuading and penetrating political, social, and economic elites. This really does come from the work of Erica Chenoweth that looks at how social movements happen. It's by co-optation. That's relational as well. People do that. Leaders do that. Also, figuring out how institutions that were forged in the 20th century and before become truly 21st century facile, resilient institutions. Those require institutional shifts, geopolitical shifts. Leaders, people are going to have to lead that. And then I would say last but not least, the work of movements in many ways is all about mobilizing people around a collective identity. And I think the work that we're all trying to do is figure out what does it look like for all of us to be change makers as the norm and not the exception. That's what we're all trying to do, and to try to shift the locus of control so we can get about doing that work and thinking hard about the narrative work that needs to happen for that to be the norm is really critical. So in some ways, I can sort of see the steps that are required in the years to come. We just have to get after it and remember that it really is existential work that we're doing in the next chapter ahead.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for that. I mean, we've been having these conversations, but I think remembering what is happening out there and why people matter, just given where we're at in the world, it's so important. So I just appreciate you bringing us back to that big picture again. Thank you, Cheryl, for taking the time. To your team, Kimberly, Ricardo, Liza, it was just wonderful hearing from all of you as well. Really, really appreciate this conversation. And I know it was a good one because there's more questions than we could get to. We will be sending out a video and recording and insights of this. So if your peers or colleagues didn't get to join, you can share it with them. And this is going to be our last People First talk for the year, but we're going to restart them again in the new year. So thanks again to everyone for joining. And again, a big thanks to you, Cheryl, and to your team for spending time and helping us learn about your work.
Radha, thank you so much. Really appreciate you. Wendy, always great to see you. Thank you for everything you do. And my colleagues, thanks for joining. And thanks to the whole group. It was a pleasure and an honor. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Have a
Take
good
care.
one.
Take
Bye.
care.